Rain dripped steadily on the dark streets, casting a gloomy haze over the city as Officer Carter Sullivan patrolled his usual route. He squinted against the dim streetlight glow when he saw her. A young, disheveled pregnant woman, shivering in the damp cold, huddled against the side of a rundown building. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide and wary, a flash of desperation flickering in her gaze. "Ma'am, you can't stay here." Carter's voice was firm, tired, worn from the weight of 1,000 nights like this. The woman, visibly scared, clutched her belly and seemed ready to respond, but her words caught in her throat. I need to be here," she whispered, voice trembling. Carter's frustration flared. He'd had his fill of excuses, of pleas for mercy he couldn't grant. In a swift, angry motion, he nudged her with his foot, hoping to prompt her to leave. But the sight of her recoiling cut through him, a pang of regret sinking in just as fast. Yet his regret was short-lived, replaced by dread when he noticed her lips quivering, mouthing words that chilled him. "You don't know who my husband is," she said softly, her tone laced with something more than fear. As Officer Carter walked away, his mind raced, haunted by the look in the woman's eyes and those foreboding words. He tried to shake off the unsettling feeling creeping through him, but a chill settled deep within, gnawing at his thoughts. Something about her desperation, her resilience despite her vulnerability, stirred up old memories he'd buried long ago, memories of his own mother's struggles. It was a comparison he didn't want to make, yet it clung to him, bringing an edge of remorse he'd rarely allowed himself to feel. Carter's life hadn't been easy. Years of facing the worst in people had hardened him, and he'd grown used to shutting down his emotions. To him, vulnerability was just another word for weakness. He hadn't always been this way, but he believed the world had left him no choice. All the nights spent alone, witnessing violence and despair, it had forged a man who kept his walls high. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't quite understand, those walls were beginning to crumble. As he reached the end of his patrol route, he replayed the incident in his mind, each detail sharper, harsher. The roughness of his kick, the way she'd cradled her belly protectively, it all made him feel as though he'd crossed an invisible line. He'd been a lawman for years, yet he couldn't remember ever feeling this level of unease over his actions. Shaking his head, he decided it was just fatigue. After all, he was used to dealing with dangerous, cunning people. This was no different. Or so he tried to convince himself. It was then that his phone buzzed, snapping him back to reality. He hesitated, anxiety prickling at him as he glanced at the screen. Unknown number. For a brief moment, he considered ignoring it. But something in the pit of his stomach compelled him to answer. "Officer Sullivan," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Silence. Then, a quiet yet unmistakably commanding voice replied, "We need to talk. About my wife." Lena held her breath as she ended the call, her hand trembling slightly. She could still feel the dull ache from where Officer Sullivan had kicked her, but her worry wasn't for herself. It was for the child growing within her, a child she and her husband had waited years to conceive. The baby represented everything she'd fought for, the future she'd dreamed of, against all odds. As she leaned against the wall, she steadied herself, trying to gather the strength to endure whatever lay ahead. She remembered her husband's words the last time he'd held her, his voice warm but burdened with responsibility. "If you're ever in trouble, don't hesitate. Call me." Lena had promised she would, even though she despised the weight of his influence and the shadows that trailed them. She'd spent years trying to live a life distanced from his powerful world, yearning for a simple existence where she wasn't just the wife. But fate seemed to always pull her back into his orbit, no matter how hard she tried to escape. Her marriage had been a paradox. While her husband was known for his fearsome reputation, he had been gentle with her, a steady presence through storms both internal and external. She often found it ironic that a man feared by many had such a soft heart for her. Still, she knew the cost of his love, secrets, evasions, a life that demanded discretion. And yet, she had chosen him, for he was her rock, her protector, even if it came at a price. As she looked around the dimly lit street, the reality of her situation sank in. She'd been wandering aimlessly, hoping for some clarity after a bitter argument at home. Yet in her moment of vulnerability, she'd met not kindness but hostility, the same relentless coldness she thought she'd left behind in her past. The officer's anger had brought old fears rushing back, haunting memories of when she'd had no one to protect her. But she wasn't that helpless girl anymore, and now she had her husband by her side. Unwanted memories from her younger years began surfacing, haunting her in fragments. The nights spent alone, the struggle for survival, the constant fear that no one would come to her rescue. Her husband had changed that. He'd brought her out of a life of shadows, teaching her what it felt like to be cherished, to be seen. But tonight, she'd felt the old powerlessness return, and it terrified her. The baby was a promise, a new beginning, but how fragile that hope seemed now. The street was quiet again, but Lena's heart was anything but. She'd learned early in life that safety could be an illusion, easily shattered. Her husband's protection offered her stability, but it also brought with it enemies she hadn't bargained for. She could endure many things, but the fear of losing her child was unbearable. It was that thought that had driven her to call him, knowing the consequences, knowing the chain reaction it would set off. A sense of calm washed over her as she imagined her husband's face. Despite his power, he was not a violent man unless provoked, unless someone threatened what he held dear. And Lena knew that he would consider the events of this night an unforgivable transgression. The fear in the officer's eyes flashed back to her, a stark contrast to his earlier aggression. She wondered if he understood now that not all battles were visible, that some of the worst fights lay within. She took a deep breath, feeling the strength that her husband's words always gave her. The pain in her side was fading, but a steely determination rose in its place. Lena had endured years of hardship, and she would not falter now. If it meant facing men like Officer Sullivan, if it meant standing her ground, she would do it, not just for herself, but for the life within her. As the minutes passed, her resolve solidified. This moment would not define her, nor would the cruelty she'd faced. In a world that had tried to strip her of her dignity, she would fight back with the quiet strength that had seen her through before. And as the familiar sound of her husband's car approached, Lena knew she was ready for whatever came next. Officer Carter's hand tightened around his phone as he listened to the man's voice on the other end. "We need to talk." "About my wife?" The calm authority in the voice left no room for doubt. Whoever this man was, he had power and influence that Carter couldn't ignore. The memory of kicking the pregnant woman sent a pang of guilt through him, but he tried to stay calm. I'm sorry, sir, but she was trespassing," he said, though his words sounded weak, even to himself. The voice remained silent for a moment, as if considering his excuse. Then, with chilling clarity, the man replied, "My wife was not trespassing. She was trying to find a moment of peace after a difficult night. You, however, chose aggression." Carter felt a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He had faced all kinds of criminals, but this was different. There was a quiet menace in the man's tone, and it left Carter feeling more vulnerable than he'd felt in years. The man continued, "I'll be there soon. Don't move." The line went dead, leaving Carter alone with the silence. His mind spun as he tried to piece together who the woman's husband could be. He hadn't seen her wearing anything that suggested wealth or status. She looked worn out, tired, just another face in the crowd. But if this man had resources, and the tone in his voice suggested he did, then Carter realized he might have just made a terrible mistake. Carter scanned the street, his heart pounding as he waited. Shadows stretched along the buildings, and he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, heavy and suffocating. He wished he could turn back time, handle things differently. But there was no going back now. All he could do was hope this man wasn't as powerful as he feared. Yet deep down, he knew the situation was slipping beyond his control. As he waited, fragments of his own past crept into his mind. He remembered a time when he was the one begging for mercy, a kid in trouble with no one to turn to. Life had taught him to be tough, to survive without looking back. But now, standing on this dark street, he wondered if he had lost something important along the way. Something human. The weight of his actions began to feel like more than just a professional error. It felt like a moral failure. A car pulled up slowly, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Carter straightened, trying to steady his nerves as a tall man stepped out of the vehicle. He was well-dressed, his posture radiating control and authority. Carter felt a mix of fear and awe. This man had an undeniable presence. The stranger's eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made Carter swallow hard. He knew, without a word spoken, that this was the woman's husband. The man approached, each step calm and deliberate. Carter resisted the urge to step back, reminding himself that he was an officer, someone who held authority too. But the confidence he usually felt on the job seemed to evaporate in the man's presence. "You're Officer Sullivan, I presume?" the man said, his voice level yet piercing. Carter nodded, unsure of what to say, his usual composure slipping. "Do you have any idea what you've done tonight?" the man asked, his gaze unflinching. Carter felt his mouth go dry. He wanted to explain, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. This man's calm anger was worse than any outburst, more unsettling than any threat. "My wife is carrying our child," the man continued, his voice breaking slightly on the last word. For a moment, Carter saw something vulnerable in his eyes, a flash of pain, quickly masked. Carter opened his mouth, desperate to explain, but the man held up a hand, silencing him. "You've done enough, officer," he said quietly. "I didn't come here to listen to excuses. I came to make sure you understand the gravity of what you did." Carter stood there, feeling smaller than he'd ever felt. In that moment, he knew this was more than a reprimand. It was a lesson, one that would haunt him for a long time. The man's gaze didn't waver as he looked at Carter, eyes cold and assessing. "You thought she was just another nobody, didn't you?" he asked, voice calm but laced with a quiet intensity. Carter's throat tightened. He knew it was true. He'd judged her based on how she looked, the worn-out clothes, the vulnerability she showed. He hadn't seen her as someone with a story, with someone who would fight for her. Now, standing before this man, Carter realized just how wrong he'd been. "I didn't mean for things to go that far," Carter said, trying to explain himself. "I was just doing my job." But even as he said the words, he could feel how empty they sounded. The man's expression remained unchanged, but his silence spoke louder than any accusation. He seemed to be searching Carter's face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse. And under that scrutinizing gaze, Carter felt like his excuses were flimsy shields, unable to hide the truth. The man took a deep breath, as if restraining himself. "My wife may not have looked like much to you, officer, but she means everything to me," he said softly. Carter could hear the pain beneath his calm words, the way each syllable was filled with a deeper, unspoken hurt. It was a kind of love Carter hadn't seen in years, a love fierce and unyielding. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had cared for him like that, and he felt a pang of something almost like envy. "I'm sorry," Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was all he could think to say, even though he knew it wasn't enough. The man gave a small nod, acknowledging his words, but there was no forgiveness in his eyes. "Sorry doesn't change what you did. It doesn't take back the fear you put in her heart tonight." Carter felt those words hit him like a blow. He hadn't thought about the fear he'd caused. He'd only thought of his authority, his own sense of control. The man's jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides as if he was holding back a storm of emotions. For a brief moment, Carter feared the man would retaliate, that he would lash out physically. But instead, he took a step back, his voice cold but calm. "I could report you. Make sure you lose everything you've worked for," he said, each word measured and precise. "But I won't. I think there's something you need to understand first." Carter looked at him, confused, as the man continued. "I want you to remember tonight, Officer Sullivan. Remember how easily you dismissed her, how you assumed you had all the power." He paused, his gaze steady. "Because there will come a day when you'll find yourself in a similar position, and I hope you think twice before you hurt someone who can't fight back." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable, settling into Carter's mind like a weight he couldn't lift. For the first time, Carter felt a true sense of shame. It wasn't just regret for his actions, it was a realization of how far he'd strayed from the person he'd once wanted to be. In his pursuit of control and authority, he'd lost his compassion, his understanding of the people he served. Standing before this man, he felt stripped down, exposed in a way he hadn't felt in years. And he couldn't deny the truth of the man's words. The man stepped back, signaling the end of their conversation. "Take care, Officer Sullivan," he said, his tone almost soft. "And remember, power doesn't make you invincible. It just makes you responsible." With that, he turned, his figure disappearing into the night as quickly as he'd arrived. Carter stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling the enormity of what had just happened sink in. As the silence settled around him, Carter knew this night would stay with him. It would haunt him, not as a story of punishment, but as a reminder of the choices he'd made and the man he'd become. And he realized, perhaps for the first time, that he had the power to change. To be the kind of officer, the kind of man who wouldn't make the same mistake again. The man drove through the quiet streets, the city lights casting a pale glow over the road as he replayed the events in his mind. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. Seeing his wife so vulnerable, so shaken, had struck a deep fear in him, one he rarely allowed himself to feel. He knew she was strong, had seen her face life's hardships with unbreakable resilience. But tonight was different. Tonight, he had seen a fragility in her that left him uneasy. As he pulled into the driveway, he took a steadying breath, gathering himself before going inside. His heart pounded as he entered the house, feeling the weight of the encounter with Officer Sullivan still heavy on his shoulders. He didn't want Lena to see how much it had affected him. She had already been through enough tonight. Instead, he would be her strength, her calm after the storm. He walked through the door, finding her in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, her face still pale. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. She nodded, but he could see that she was still shaken. Moving closer, he took her hand gently, feeling the warmth of her fingers against his. Her grip was weak, a reminder of just how much tonight had drained her. "I'm sorry I wasn't there sooner," he said, his voice heavy with regret. Lena managed a small smile, the glimmer of her usual strength shining through. "You came as soon as I needed you," she whispered, squeezing his hand. Her words were a balm to him, easing some of the tension coiled in his chest. He sat down beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. In the quiet of their home, he felt the anger and fear from earlier start to fade, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude that she was safe. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of the night settling around them like a heavy fog. Lena rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes as she took slow, steady breaths. He could feel her heartbeat, soft and steady against him, and he let that simple rhythm calm him. This was what mattered, being here for her, making sure she felt safe. No officer, no stranger's cruelty would ever take that from them. After a moment, Lena looked up at him, her gaze steady. "Thank you for standing up for me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, studying her expression. There was a strength in her that had always inspired him, a resilience he admired deeply. "You know I'd do anything for you," he replied, his tone resolute. "You and our child are everything to me." Lena's hand drifted to her belly, a protective gesture that made his heart ache. This child was their hope, a new beginning. The thought of anyone threatening her, made him tighten his hold on her. But he also knew that carrying anger wouldn't help them move forward. He had seen too many people lose themselves to bitterness, and he was determined to keep his family safe from that. "I don't want to be afraid every time I step outside," Lena murmured, her voice laced with vulnerability. He nodded, understanding the depth of her words. "You won't be," he assured her, his voice firm. "I'll make sure of it." And as he spoke, he realized that his promise extended beyond just protecting her physically. It was a vow to create a life where she could feel safe, to build a future where they didn't have to live in fear. Together, They sat in the stillness of their home, both quietly vowing to leave this night behind them. They knew it wouldn't be easy. Wounds like these took time to heal. But as he held her close, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a drive to be the husband and father they both needed him to be. In that quiet moment, he realized that his greatest strength was not in power or control, but in the love he held for them. Something no one could ever take away. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room as Lena stirred awake. Her husband was already up, quietly moving around the kitchen, making her favorite tea. She watched him for a moment, a sense of calm settling over her. The night's events felt distant, but the memory of Officer Sullivan's actions still weighed on her mind. She wanted to forget, to let it go, but the fear she'd felt lingered like a shadow, refusing to fade. As she sat up, her husband turned and noticed her awake, his face softening. "Good morning," he greeted, setting down the mug in front of her. She took it gratefully, savoring the warmth. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his eyes filled with concern. Lena forced a small smile, appreciating his care, but couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. "I'm okay, just thinking about last night," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I know. It's hard to shake off something like that." Sitting beside her, he took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles gently. "I talked to some people this morning," he began, hesitating before he continued. "About Officer Sullivan." Lena's brow furrowed, her curiosity piqued. She hadn't expected him to look into it further, but a part of her felt relieved. She needed closure, something to help her move forward. Her husband took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "It turns out Sullivan has a history of using force where it isn't necessary." Lena's eyes widened as she listened, realizing that her encounter with the officer hadn't been an isolated incident. "Why is he still allowed to work then?" she asked, frustration mixing with the unease she already felt. Her husband's gaze darkened slightly. "It's complicated. People like him often slip through the cracks." Lena felt a knot tighten in her stomach as he spoke. Knowing that Officer Sullivan had hurt others made her feel both anger and sadness. How many people had suffered because of his actions? She thought about the fear she'd felt in that dark street, the helplessness of knowing she had no one to turn to until her husband arrived. "So what happens now?" she asked, a quiet strength in her voice. She needed to know there would be justice, that people like him wouldn't go unchecked. Her husband squeezed her hand gently. "I've spoken with the department. They're going to launch an investigation," his tone steady but cautious. "It may take time, but I'll make sure they follow through." Lena felt a surge of relief, though it was tempered by the reality of how long such processes could take. Still, knowing that action was being taken gave her some comfort. She felt lighter, more hopeful that change was possible. As they sat together, a thought occurred to Lena. "He wasn't always like that, she murmured, surprising herself. Her husband looked at her, slightly puzzled. "The officer, I saw something in his eyes last night, right before you arrived. It was like he regretted what he did, even if he couldn't admit it." She paused, wondering why she felt the need to defend him. Perhaps it was her own empathy, her understanding of how pain could shape people in ways they didn't intend. Her husband considered her words, nodding thoughtfully. "People carry a lot of baggage, but that doesn't excuse what he did to you," he replied gently. "Still, maybe this will be a wake-up call for him too." Lena looked down, feeling a strange mix of sympathy and sadness. She didn't want Sullivan to suffer. She just wanted him to understand the harm he'd caused and hopefully change. In her heart, she knew that real justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about transformation. They sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts, united by the hope that something good could come from this dark experience. Lena felt a deep sense of gratitude for her husband's strength and support, and in that moment, she understood how lucky she was. Together, they were stronger, and together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, determined to build a life of peace and resilience. Later that afternoon, Lena found herself sitting alone in their quiet living room, sunlight spilling over the floor as she mulled over everything that had happened. She thought about the investigation her husband had set into motion, the promises he had made to protect her. But the more she reflected, the more a different idea took shape in her mind. Justice was important, but what she truly wanted was to understand, to give Officer Sullivan a chance to face what he had done. After a few minutes, she reached for her phone, hesitating before dialing her husband. She knew he'd be cautious, even wary about what she had in mind. But she felt a pull, a need to do something that would allow her to move forward without the weight of anger holding her back. When her husband picked up, his warm voice greeted her, and she felt a sense of calm settle over her. "I've been thinking," she began, choosing her words carefully. Her husband listened as she explained. "I want to meet him, just once," she said, surprising even herself with how steady her voice sounded. She could hear her husband's hesitation on the other end. "Are you sure?" he asked, his tone gentle but laced with concern. "Yes," Lena replied firmly. "I need to see if he's willing to change. I think it will help me heal." Her husband sighed, but after a moment he agreed, promising to make the necessary arrangements. The next day, they arranged to meet Officer Sullivan in a neutral public place, a small cafe near the police station. Lena's heart raced as she waited at the table, her husband seated beside her for support. She didn't know what she expected from this meeting, but she knew it was something she had to do. As she took a deep breath, she saw Officer Sullivan enter, his expression a mix of nervousness and curiosity. He walked over to them, sitting down carefully, his gaze lowered. Lena studied him for a moment, noticing the tired lines around his eyes, the way he avoided direct eye contact. It was a stark contrast to the cold, hardened officer she had encountered that night. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, breaking the silence. He nodded, still not meeting her gaze, and she could see the weight of regret on his face. "I didn't know about your situation," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for things to go that far." Taking a deep breath, Lena met his eyes. "I don't want excuses, Officer Sullivan," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I want to know why. Why did you feel you needed to treat me that way?" Her question hung in the air, and for a moment he struggled to respond. Finally, he let out a sigh, shoulders sagging as he confessed. I don't know. Maybe I've just lost my way. I've been doing this job for so long, and somewhere along the line, I stopped seeing people. I started seeing problems." Lena listened, feeling a mixture of sadness and understanding. She could tell he was struggling with his own remorse, the weight of his choices evident in his every word. "Everyone has struggles," she replied gently. "But that doesn't give us the right to hurt others. I hope you understand the pain you caused, not just to me, but to yourself." Her words seemed to strike a chord, and for the first time, Officer Sullivan looked up, meeting her gaze with a flicker of something like gratitude. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I know that might not mean much, but I really am." Lena nodded, accepting his words, feeling a sense of peace start to replace her anger. "I don't want you to lose your job, Officer Sullivan. I just want you to think twice before you hurt someone again," she said, her tone soft but firm. "We all deserve compassion, even when it's hard to give." As they sat in quiet understanding, Lena felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had come seeking closure, and she found it not through retribution, but through a shared moment of vulnerability. They might never meet again, but she knew this encounter would stay with both of them. As they left the cafe, her husband took her hand, pride and admiration in his eyes. Together they walked away, knowing they had turned a painful moment into a powerful lesson on forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, Lena felt a new sense of peace settling into her life. The nightmares she'd had after the encounter with Officer Sullivan began to fade, replaced by a quiet strength. Each morning, she woke up feeling a little lighter, her heart a little fuller. Her husband noticed the change in her, smiling as he watched her go about her day with a renewed sense of calm. They had both been through a lot, but Lena could feel that they had come out of it stronger than before. One afternoon, she received an unexpected letter in the mail. She recognized the handwriting instantly, Officer Sullivan. Hesitating, she opened it carefully, unsure of what she would find inside. His words were brief, but sincere. He wrote about how their meeting had forced him to reflect, to see the harm he'd caused not only to her, but to himself. "Thank you for giving me a chance to change," he had written. "I've started attending counseling. I want to be the kind of officer who protects, not harms." Lena's heart softened as she read the letter. She hadn't expected him to reach out, and certainly not with such honesty. But knowing that he was trying to change filled her with hope. She thought about the pain and fear that had once clouded her thoughts, and how forgiveness had allowed her to see beyond that darkness. With a small smile, she folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, a reminder of how far she had come and of the unexpected power of empathy. As days turned into months, Lena and her husband prepared for the arrival of their child. Each step brought new excitement and joy, from decorating the nursery to attending doctor's appointments together. She felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for the family they were building, but for the strength they had discovered within themselves. Her husband was her rock, her unwavering support, and together, they looked forward to this new chapter in their lives. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, her husband took her hand, his gaze warm and steady. "You amaze me," he said quietly. "The way you handled everything, I don't think I could have been that strong." Lena smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "I think we all have that strength deep down," she replied. "Sometimes it just takes the right moment to find it." They sat in comfortable silence, both content, both changed by everything they had endured. Meanwhile, Officer Sullivan continued his path to redemption. He began reaching out to community programs, working with troubled teens, and attending workshops on compassion and empathy. He knew he couldn't erase his past mistakes, but he could work to prevent future ones. Each time he felt the urge to revert to old habits, he remembered Lena's words, her calm strength in the face of his aggression. Her forgiveness became his guiding light, a reminder of the kind of person he wanted to be. Months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Lena and her husband welcomed their child into the world. Holding their baby for the first time, they felt an overwhelming sense of joy and love, a love that washed away all the pain and fear of the past. Looking down at her newborn's tiny face, Lena knew that every difficult moment had led them here, to this beautiful, precious life. This child was a symbol of resilience, of hope, of the strength they had found together. As Lena rocked her baby in her arms, she thought of how one encounter had changed everything. Not just for her, but for everyone involved. She had learned that forgiveness was not weakness, but a powerful tool for healing, for rebuilding. And she hoped that her story, their story, would inspire others to look beyond anger, to find compassion even in the hardest of moments. Lena's husband watched them with a soft smile, his heart full. He knew their journey hadn't been easy, but he felt blessed to be by her side, watching her grow, watching them grow together as a family. In his heart, he thanked Lena for her courage, for her ability to turn pain into wisdom, and for teaching him the true meaning of strength. And as the seasons changed, so did their lives, filled with the quiet beauty of forgiveness, love, and new beginnings. Together they looked forward, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that they would face it with a deep, unbreakable bond. If you liked this story, please consider subscribe to the channel, and feel free to tell me in the comments what you liked the most in the story. See you later.